Hello, this is Anna Pacheco, SantaFe101.com. My guest today is David Rasch, and he has a lot of knowledge about living in historic Santa Fe. He was formerly with the city of Santa Fe in their historic preservation office. David, do I have your permission to record this interview?
Yes.
Oh, good. So tell me, again, this is an incredibly old city. We're the oldest capital city in the country. Everybody wants to move here, or many people want to move here. Tell me, from your past experience, working with the city in terms of historic preservation, what people should know if they're thinking about moving here, especially if they're thinking of moving to one of the historic neighborhoods in Santa Fe.
Yes. Well, there are five historic districts in Santa Fe, and they're all kind of connected to one another. And downtown and eastward along Canyon Road and up to Canyon Upper Road. But it is probably one of the oldest historic ordinances in the country. There's about five that came in around when ours did in 1957, and it predates the federal laws in preservation as well. So it's very old in historic preservation. And Santa Fe has very unique architecture as well. The Pueblo-Spanish Revival, the Territorial Revival, it's all part of a response to the City Beautiful movement, which was trying to kind of unify the look of American towns in a way that we didn't really want, and created our own kind of architectural design by looking at Pueblo architecture and Spanish architecture and how they melded into what Santa Fe style is all about, with flat roofed buildings and brown stuccoed walls. But the five historic districts will really only take up about 18% of all of Santa Fe, but it is in the high end of real estate on the east side of Santa Fe is in
So can you
historic
name them for
districts.
me? I know my cousin lives in South Capitol, so that's a historic district.
That
Uh,
one is called the Don Gaspar Area Historic District.
so that's it. Okay.
Um, then there's the East Downtown and East Side Historic District. That's the most restrictive one, where the Pueblo Spanish Revival and Territorial Revival are required.
And is
Uh,
that close to the plaza? Is that why?
yeah, circling the plaza and going east to the end of the city limits. Then we've got the Guadalupe Historic District, which is along the rail yard. The Transition Historic District, which is the smallest between the rail yard and the downtown. We already mentioned the Don Gaspar Area Historic District, which is South Capitol. And the last one is the Review District, which is the southeast side of town. And they all have different standards, but they all are a way that the city says what you can do to the outside of your building.
Let me just
So
ask you, so I don't know, what would the southeast section be? Just give me a name of a street or something so I can kind of
that would be
visualize.
Old Santa Fe Trail, coming off of Old Pecos Trail and going all the way down to about Zia Road.
Okay, good. So basically the city, in those five districts, if you were to buy a home, number one, it's probably going to be more expensive than any other part of the city. Is that correct?
Typically, that's the higher real estate area of town, yes.
Okay, and so if you were to move to this area, what do people have to approve you? Does a realtor have to say, hey, so and so wants to move to this historic district? Do they need to know? Is it kind of like a co-op or something where people have to know who's moving in?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's buyer beware. You need to know what the rules are of the building or property that you're buying. Not only underlying zoning rules, for example, um, how many buildings, what kind of use they have, how much parking is required. Those are all underlying zoning. But the overlay historic preservation district rules are about aesthetics, what the exterior of the building can look like, how tall it can be, what kind of windows you can put in, what color it can be, those types of things.
Well, I want to ask you, I was going to mention windows because most of these homes are older now. And
Yes,
so, they need to, people need to have new windows. That's not an aesthetic thing. That's a practical thing. Like, do they tell you can only use Anderson windows or you have to use wood frame, or how does that work? How particular do they get?
yes. Well, there's a very important aspect of any structure in the historic districts, and that is its assigned historic status. All structures should have an assigned historic status, either of significant, contributing, or non-contributing. A non-contributing building is one that's less than 50 years old, or if it's very old, older than 50 years old, it's been altered so much that it lost its historic character. A significant building is at least 50 years old and has most of its historic character. There could be small remodels, whether non-historic or historic. And a contributing building is still 50 years old, but it has alterations, but it hasn't been so altered that it loses its historic character. Now, on a significant building, if your property has a significant building, all exterior sides of the building are considered primary. And so historic material must be retained. If you have a historic window, it has to be preserved. It can't be replaced. So you'll have to pay to have it restored if it's in bad condition. On a contributing building, the H board, the Historic Districts Review Board, has to assign primary elevations for a contributing building. It can't be all of the exterior walls, but it has to be at least one. So on a contributing building, you can't replace historic windows, but on non-primary elevations, you can. And on non-contributing buildings, there's no historic material that needs to be retained, so you can replace those windows. Now, depending on what historic district you're in, it tells you what type of windows you can put in. In the Downtown and Eastside Historic District, all window panes cannot exceed 30 inches in the diagonal. So you'll need true divided whites or simulated divided whites with muntins, making those grill patterns on the windows. In that district, that is required.
Isn't that what happened? I think it was a few years ago. I know they were trying to get the funding for the Palace of the Governors. They had to replace the windows, and it was going to be very costly because they had to keep them exactly like they were 100 years ago or something.
Yes, so if you have historic windows on a primary elevation and they are beyond repair, you can get permission to replace them, but you'll have to replace them in kind. Now, the way to decide if they're beyond repair is you assess all the pieces of the window. If it's a wooden window, look at all the numbers of pieces of wood on there, and each piece of wood has to have more than 30% rot for you to replace the entire window. That's not often the case. So often the case, the bottom is where the rot is. You may have to replace certain parts of the wood, not the entire window, in order to preserve as much historic material as possible. And once you get permission to replace a historic window, it has to be in kind. So if it's a wooden double hung window, it has to be a new wooden double hung window. Or if it's a wooden slider or a casement window, whatever type of mechanism that makes it open or close, that would have to be mimicked. Or if it's a steel casement window, you can get steel windows nowadays, but typically it's more common to go with an aluminum frame window. So they may require maintaining the metal frame instead of going from a historic metal window to a new wooden window.
Well,
So
I have
like
my cousin who lives in the South Capital District. He said that because he's in that district, these newer roofs they use now, they're called TPO or some kind of a white, it's a different type of material now. So he said that they're not allowed to do that. So like if you live in a historic district, and everybody has roof problems here because we have so many of us have flat roofs. So you're going to have to replace a roof at least every 10 years. What do people in historic districts do? I mean, what's historic about tar? Do you know what I mean? I mean, in the old days, you didn't have that.
it's really about the aesthetics with the roofing material. So if you have a flat roof, you also have parapets, which are those walls that go up at the sides, at the exterior of the roof, to cover the view of the top of the roof. Now, you can do whatever type of roofing material you want. It just can't be publicly visible. And so a lot of roofers will take the material on the roof up the interior of the parapet and over the top of the parapet so that you can see it from the street. That's typically what the Historic Preservation Division doesn't allow, is visible roofing. As long as it's on the roof and on the inside of the parapet, that would be fine. Even if it's the white plastic material, that still can be used.
And then what happens, you know, the preservation committee, do people go around these neighborhoods and check to see if anything's being changed? Or when you go file for a permit to do work, is that how they find out about it? Or how does this
Yes.
policing work?
Yes, the Historic Preservation Division does have an inspector who goes around the city reviewing projects that have gotten permits to watch as their progress goes. But as he's moving around the city, he does look for violations. So if someone is working on a building and there's no publicly posted permit, he may stop to say, do you have a permit? And if you don't, you'll get what's known as a red tag or a stop work order, meaning you have to stop everything you're doing and go get approval and a permit before you can continue. So that's a risk that you don't want to take, because you may have to stop in the middle of doing something that could be damaging to the building, and then you'd have to cover it with plastic or something until you get approval and a permit.
And then what about the interior of these historic homes? Can you do what you want inside, or do you have to have, like, follow a certain protocol in that as well?
Typically, historic preservation doesn't have any jurisdiction over the interior of a building. The Historic Santa Fe Foundation, one of the nonprofits in town, may have easements on your property, so you should find out if they're also listed on your property. If they have an easement, you do need to check with them because it could be an interior easement. Very important historic buildings do have interior easements.
And what does that mean,
They,
interior easement? What does that mean?
where they have listed character defining features that need to be preserved not only on the exterior, but also on the interior. And you'd have to ask them for permission to alter an interior easement. The city of Santa Fe wouldn't get involved with that, but that could be a historic Santa Fe Foundation issue.
Well, you know, that's kind of that. I mean, that's kind of sounds frustrating to me. Like if somebody purchases a home for a lot of money and they want to do something, but they have to ask a group or somebody to ask permission to do something with their home that they've paid for.
Yes. And Historic Santa Fe Foundation plaques buildings with a metal shield shaped plaque on the exterior. Um, and you should know before you buy the house if it has any Historic Santa Fe Foundation easements on it.
So if you're looking, maybe there's a, you know, does your realtor, are all the realtors pretty up on this? Can they say, I want you to know that if you're looking at a home in this area, you're going to have to go through X, Y, and Z? Does that take place, or how would people know this?
Yeah, typically the realtors do know if the property is in a historic district or which archaeological district it's in. They may not know about the Historic Santa Fe Foundation because that's not a city program. And there's very few properties that actually have easements on them with the foundation.
So, in terms of buyer beware, what else should they be aware of? Else should they be aware of, or be aware of?
Yeah, the main thing is understand what district you're in, understand what your historic designation is, and if it is designated as a historic structure, what the primary elevations are. Those are the main things. With archaeology, the entire town is archaeological districts. There's 3 different archaeological districts. The Downtown Historic Archaeological Review District is right downtown, where most of the archaeology is. Then there's the River and Trails Archaeological Review District and the Suburban Archaeological Review District. They're all about ground disturbance. So if you're going to put on an addition, demolish a building, build an addition, build a new building, build a wall or fence, wherever you're disturbing the ground, putting in utility lines, that's where you have to check to see about archaeology. And it's all about how much ground you're disturbing. In the downtown district, the most restrictive, 2,500 square feet of disturbance or 150 feet of linear channeling for utilities requires an archaeological clearance first before you can even get a permit. The other 2 districts, River and Trails is 2-acre lot size, Suburban is a 10-acre lot size. And you'll have to hire an archaeologist to survey your property and go to the Archaeological Review Committee to get clearance, whether they find nothing or something. If they find something, you can either pay to have the archaeological resource removed and documented, or if you don't want to pay for that, you can put an easement on it, which has to go on your plat. and that preserves that underground resource where you can't disturb the ground.
And when you say find something, you're more than likely meaning bones or something remain.
Or fragments of cultural history, pottery, metal, horseshoes, things associated with the Santa Fe Trail. Along the river, you may find more Native American things. I remember a copper smelting site along the river at one time.
But that would belong to the city, wouldn't it? Or I mean, you buy the property, so you find all these these great pottery shards. They belong to you now, or they belong to the city?
Yes, they belong to the property owner. You can pay to have them curated into the state system, but it's not inexpensive. But you do own the archaeology on your property.
Okay, that's a good thought. So what other cities, like I'm thinking maybe like Charlotte or somewhere in the South, what other like historic cities would be comparable to Santa Fe in terms of these types of restrictions?
Yes, let's see. Montreal. What's the big town in Florida with the Spanish colonial fort?
San Augustine?
And Augustine, um, um, Williamsburg. There's a few. There's about 5 that are contention with Santa Fe for the oldest historic districts. But even Phoenix, most people don't think of Phoenix as a historic town, but Phoenix even has historic districts.
Well, that's probably a good thing. So they preserve some of it,
Yes. Typically, it's a 50-year rule, so easily most cities have buildings that are older than 50 years old.
And what would happen if you have a house in the historic district and it burns to the ground? Are you required to rebuild exactly the way it looked? Or do your neighbors have a say about it? Because if you're in this historic area, that means your neighbors probably are as well. Do you still have to abide by, if you have something, like you're starting from scratch, not because of, no fault of yours, do you have to build what was there before?
Well, there's a good example of what happened to the Inijos house on Palace Avenue. That was a historic contributing structure. It had a fire, destroyed most of the building. And I believe the owner who bought the building went to the H board and said, I would like to rebuild it in kind, which was exactly what the H board would want, especially for a significant historic building. This
And
one
what
was
building was that? I'm sorry.
Hinojos house,
Okay.
Hinohos.
And it burned, and so they just rebuilt the same thing then?
Yes, they rebuilt it in kind, which is really same thing with the demolition by neglect with historic wood windows. If it's rotten, you can replace it in kind. So they applied that idea to the entire structure. But if it's really destroyed, then you could go to the H board and ask for a new design, and it just has to harmonize with the streetscape. But they're going to want it to harmonize in a way that the original did as well.
So a
height,
lot of
color.
the historic areas, most of Santa Fe does not have central air conditioning. So I take it if you're in a historic district, you can't plop an air conditioning unit on your roof then.
Correct. Any rooftop appurtenance that's publicly visible is not allowed without an exception. Any type of code that you don't want to follow, you do have the opportunity to apply for an exception. You do have to prove a hardship with legal findings. You do have to pay a fee. You have to answer 6 criteria. It's not that easy to get an exception, but you can always apply for one. But typically, rooftop equipment, not publicly visible, you can find places on your roof possibly to hide it or put it down on the ground and screen it with a coyote fence or something. There are ways to get around your needs, but if it must be publicly visible, you will need to have an exception.
So in your professional opinion, is it worth the trouble? I mean, to live in, I mean, some people, they just have to be a block off the plaza, or in your professional opinion, is it worth it to go through not only the expense, but through all the hassle? I mean, I've heard that you can't like, paint your mailbox. You can't do anything really.
Well, that's the thing about historic districts. If you want to live in a historic district, you might have some concern about the way your neighborhood looks. And what your neighbors can do. So if you do feel that way, living in the historic district is perfect for you. It does apply a lot of standards and a lot of restrictions, but at least you do have comfort in knowing that your neighbor can't paint their house orange or can't build a 3-story addition to their house next to yours. So there's good and bad about the historic district regulations. And I think mostly it gives you a peace of mind that you are living in an area that is highly regulated in aesthetics.
Right, and it makes sense in the sense that, I mean, if we didn't have a lot of these things in place, Santa Fe wouldn't look the way it does today. I mean, it would be a completely different, it would be all over the place. And so that's what makes Santa Fe so unique and beautiful. You know, we're out of time here, but just quickly, let me know, what are you up to these days? I know you're doing something with the Spanish Colonial Arts Museum. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yes, so the Spanish Colonial Arts Society is nearing 100 years old. We were established in 1925 in order to preserve and promote the traditional Hispanic arts. And that's why we started Spanish Market, and now we have the Museum of Spanish Colonial Art. And I'm in charge of the collections and the museum galleries. And now I'm curating exhibits using our permanent collection.
Oh, good, good. So do you see any kind of like, is there like overlap, or was this like a natural transition for you, having worked all that time with the city on the historic, in the historic preservation?
It's certainly a little of both. We do have a historic structure. We are in the East Side Review District, and this is a John Gaumeme house built in 1930. In the Review District, there aren't any primary elevations or contributing status, but this building would probably get contributing or significant status. So I do bring that historic architecture to this job as well, including art as well as architecture. It's a little
Excellent.
both.
Well, you know, I want to thank you. And I guess if anybody's watching this interview, I guess the bottom line is, if you're looking in Santa Fe and some of the older parts of town, you really should be working with a knowledgeable realtor who can bring all these different regulations and rules to your attention before you buy it, because it may or may not work for you. Although
Exactly.
it's
Yeah.
okay. Listen, I want to thank you again.
Thank you.
Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.